Brian Berletic. Brian, welcome back to the show. Let me start, if I may, with this grain deal. The hue and cry has gone up that Russia is going to starve the poor people of the world, which is, of course, an endless preoccupation of Western leaders, how the people in the poorest parts of the world are doing today. But that's not, of course, at all true. But explain these to the viewers. What is this deal? Why has Russia pulled out of it?
The grain deal was supposed to be an act of good faith by Russia to allow Ukraine to ship grain out of its ports, primarily Odessa. And this grain was supposed to go to countries in need, but it was not going to countries in need. It was going to Europe, so much so that several nations in Eastern Europe, part of the European Union, had to protest the amount of Ukrainian grain flowing into Europe rather than to these countries that now the UN says supposedly will be starving. And in addition to this, the grain deal and the corridor that it opened in the Black Sea was being used to carry out attacks by Ukraine and its Western sponsors on targets in Crimea. And it is suspected that this most recent attack on the Crimean bridge was a result of Ukraine abusing this corridor that was supposed to be used only to ship grain.
So Ukraine and its friends are seeking to contest in practice the Russian cancellation of the deal. I don't know who's going to ensure them, but they're threatening to sail ships into Odessa. I'm not sure of their fate there, but they're, in other words, going to challenge Russia. Can they meaningfully do that?
I don't think that they can. I believe that there's now going to be essentially a blockade, just as there was when the special military operation began in February 2022. I think the United States has openly said that they are not going to send warships in. I don't think anyone would be interested in doing that because that would be another step toward direct confrontation and possible war with Russia. And the whole point of fighting a proxy war at the expense of the Ukrainian people rather than at the expense of the US and NATO is to not actually get directly involved.
Now, you mentioned the latest attack on the bridge, which was wildly celebrated in Western Ukraine, even though the only casualties were a mother and father who were killed, leaving their 14-year-old daughter alive, but an orphan and in serious condition in hospital. Russia called that an act of terrorism. It's difficult to call it anything else, isn't it?
It is difficult to call it anything else because the roadways that are part of the Crimean Bridge are strictly civilian, for civilian use. At one point, Russia was using the railway to move military equipment, but they haven't done that, to my knowledge, in months since the last attack. And besides that, even if this bridge was entirely destroyed, and even if Ukraine could somehow punch through the layered defenses in Zaporozhye and Kherson and cut the so-called land bridge, Crimea would still be able to sustain itself. People have to remember that this bridge was built in 2018. The Crimean Peninsula joined the Russian Federation in 2014. So for several years, it existed without a land bridge and without a physical bridge across the Kerch Strait. And it could do that again. Both the military facilities in Crimea and the civilian population could be sustained by air and by sea, because that is how Crimea had sustained itself for several years.
It was a performative act of terrorism, wasn't it? It had no military significance. The casualties, as I've said, were a small family destroyed by this act of terrorism. There's no, in fact, the bridge is still open, it's still operating, just one lane that is inoperable. And as you say, there's now a land bridge to Crimea as a result of the of the liberation of that part of the Donbass. So it was a peculiarly performative act because, of course, it will surely be answered by Russia. What do you think they might have in mind by way of an answer?
It's really hard to tell. We've already seen very significant strikes, particularly targeting the seaports at Odessa, but that could have been a result of the grain deal collapsing and Russia's intent to ensure that no more shipping takes place since the deal was scrapped, basically. That may have been part of the retaliation. There might be more to come. After the last attack on this bridge, there was the attacks on Ukraine's power grid, and that lasted for weeks, months, and it did extensive damage. And I believe that Russia has many escalations already planned out, and they would rather not exercise these options. But as Ukraine carries out these senseless attacks, Russia has to respond in kind, or they will just simply embolden Ukraine to do this even more.
It foreshadows what I have thought and said from the beginning is a likely consequence of the war, the loss of the Black Sea to Ukraine. At the moment, Odessa as a port is now non-operative. But it can't be, I think, the Russian intention to allow business as was for Ukraine into the Black Sea, for that will always now be a point of vulnerability for Russia. So the liberation of the whole of the Black Sea coast, including, of course, the great Russian city of Odessa, must be one of the expanded war aims. And I may add, if you're going to do that, you might as well link up with Transnistria and liberate the Russian people there in Transnistria, who are subject to all kinds of threats. And indeed, the leader of the Transnistrian Communist Party was actually murdered this week because of his stand towards Russia.
Yes, I think that is a very reasonable speculation. That's all we can do right now is speculate. We don't really know what Moscow is thinking in terms of the greater plan, but that would make sense to, if it's impossible to take or unfavorable to take all of Ukraine, especially the most western parts of Ukraine, and at least take the sea coast to deny them access to the Black Sea and leave whatever is left of this essentially NATO controlled, occupied Ukraine, leave that for the European Union, let that be a weight around their neck. And they've created it, and that would be very fitting. So I think that would be very reasonable, but we just have to wait and see if that does actually materialize.
Now, what's happening on the ground in the war itself along the front? Quite significant Russian breakthroughs, several kilometers in some parts. It looks like it's not just the Ukrainian counteroffensive that has faltered, and everyone now acknowledges that it has faltered. Even the New York Times, even NATO acknowledged that, but that the Russians are making a counteroffensive of their own.
Yes, that's true. This was supposed to be a massive Ukrainian offensive. It was supposed to sweep southward through Kherson and Zaporozhye. It was also aimed at the Donbas region. There was even the slight possibility in their minds that they could take back Bakhmut. And what happened instead is now in the east, Russia is on the offensive. They are taking territory there. The offensive for Ukraine has failed in the south. We saw the New York Times admit that 20% of the equipment transferred over to Ukraine was lost. And if that's what they're admitting, one wonders what the actual number is. And then what is the number of manpower lost in this offensive? Because after the breakthroughs with the equipment failed, they began just sending infantry on foot to try to break through the Russian lines. And there have been massive losses for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine still has a large amount of offensive potential left. Russia has layered defenses both in the south and in the east, specifically to give way, absorb the Ukrainian offensive when the full weight of it hits their lines. And so they may still make a breakthrough, but the most important thing to keep in mind is that time is not on Ukraine's side. The numbers are not on Ukraine's side, no matter where this offensive ends on the map. Even if they were to take Bakhmut, even if they were to break through the south, wherever their military stops, it'll be utterly exhausted, and NATO lacks the capacity to replenish it.
That is, in a way, and I see in the Daily Telegraph today in England, that's, if you like, the subplot of the war, that not only has Ukraine and its soldiers have fought very bravely and sacrificed enormously, but proved, as we all knew would happen, incapable of fighting and defeating Russia. But the subplot is that the military-industrial complex in NATO countries, including in the United States, is simply not up to the task of a war with Russia. In fact, they're quite lucky that Russia will probably stop at the Dnipro, because they could probably go all the way to Berlin, given the current state of the armories and the ammunition dumps of the NATO countries.
That's true. The West collectively has neglected their military-industrial output. They have spent decades pursuing these smaller wars against developing nations. We saw these wars unfold in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. The United States is still engaged in a lot of these places. Their military-industrial complex is geared toward profit rather than any sort of purpose. They want to maximize profits, and maintaining massive capacity is not profitable. On the other hand, Russia inherited a massive military-industrial capacity from the Soviet Union. Not only did they maintain it, but they modernized it, and now they're expanding it. And this is something that takes years to do. This is something that the West now realizes they have to do, but they simply don't have time. They're talking about expanding production for their artillery shells by 2027, but when you actually look at the numbers, even when they do that, if they do that, it still will not be enough to sustain the daily rate of fire of Ukrainian forces now, which is still sometimes 10 times less than what Russia is firing on the battlefield. So this is an unsolvable problem, and this is why we see the West and also Ukraine focusing on basically PR rather than on sound tactics and strategy on the battlefield.
On the other hand, Brian, are things beginning to brighten up in Sino-US relations? One saw Janet Yellen, on magic mushrooms or not, kowtowing to the Chinese minister 4, 5 times. And there, to me, as an outsider, and you're living and working in the region, there seems like a slight thaw in US-China relations. Have I got that wrong?
I would like to believe that there was, but unfortunately, this fits a pattern the United States has followed for many years, where they pose as pursuing diplomacy with their adversaries while behind the scenes continuing to provoke them. And then when their adversary reacts to those provocations behind the scenes, they say, aha, see, we tried diplomacy, and they are intent on aggression. So now we have no choice but to pursue more sanctions and more aggression and possibly even war. They've done this with Russia. If people remember, then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the reset button she gave Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, or if we remember the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, these were all facades. The U.S. created to appear to pursue diplomacy, all while preparing the dagger of betrayal. And I believe they're doing the exact same thing regarding China now.
Now, Brian, finally, one of our legends, Simon in Florida, asked me to ask you about PETA in Thailand. I have no idea what he meant, but maybe you do.
PETA is the name of the most recent U.S.-backed opposition leader. Actually, he's more of a proxy for the actual U.S.-backed opposition leader, a billionaire named Thanathorn Juangruangruangkit. He's unable to run because of his legal problems, so now he has PETA as his proxy, and he's trying to become prime minister, and if he cannot, he will have U.S. assistance in mobilizing violent mobs in the streets, once again, creating the same conditions we saw in Ukraine in 2014 or Libya and Syria in 2011. This really is just one playbook the U.S. uses everywhere. And the reason the U.S. is interested in Thailand is because it has such a close relationship with China, and the U.S. wants to install a client regime that would put an end to that or even reverse it.
Well, a big thanks to Simon in Florida, but an even bigger one to you, Brian Berletic, as always, the master of the new Atlas. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Show.